Hello Redshifters. Redshift 3.5.16 introduces two new changes to Redshift for 3D Studio Max. And these two changes are we've decoupled the backplate from the dome light and the environment shader. And now you have a background that's independent of the scene. Okay, and that's extremely important. I'm going to show you in a second why. And the second thing is we have a scene upgrade because we have now a new Redshift camera. And this Redshift camera, it's a bit different from the old normal camera, physical camera plus camera effects. Okay, let me show you this first in 3.5.15. So we're in 3D Studio Max 2023 with 3.5.15, and I have a very simple scene here using projection mapping and a few teapots, and I have a backplate. Now you can see here I'm using the backplate as a background in the viewport, right? And this is a perspective view, and it's basically projecting the exact same image, as you can see here, through a matte shadow catcher because I want to catch the shadows for this object onto this geometry, which doesn't cast any sort of shadows or anything. You can see here, doesn't cast shadows or self shadows. Well, it casts shadows, but not in itself. It's normal to cast shadows on the objects in the scene, right? So, and then for little teapots, nothing spectacular about it. Okay, and I could have put a big plane behind with the exact same shader. When you can see it in here, it's this guy, right? And let me show you this, right? I decided not to, so I'm gonna use, instead I have for the background, I have this little dome light that has intensity of 1. The bitmap, it has no texture for the dome light, but instead it's using a backplate and it has its contribution set to 0. So basically it doesn't do anything but acts as a background. And you can see it in here, right? Now here's the thing. If I try to change the focal point, and I can pick, in this case, I'm picking not necessarily any mesh, but the environment. Okay, and this is out of focus, you can see here, right? There's now, it can be this one in focus, we can put this one in focus. And the way this works as before, right? If you're going to the post effects tab here in the environments and effects, you're going to notice that, well, we have a few controls in here, but if you're opening the render view options, you'll see that we also have bokeh. Bokeh, it's not a post effect, it's an in-camera effect. Right? This happens at render times, while everything else happens after rendering. And the bokeh doesn't live here, for the globals lives in here. Right? And you can see if I pick focus and then Alt drag, I'm changing the circle of confusion. Right, now this changes in 3.5.16 because now we don't have a circle of confusion anymore. We have a camera aperture. And the new camera, it's a bit different than the standard camera. In this case, I have nothing in the scene. There's no camera. Okay, it's a perspective camera, but nothing else, right? I can create a camera if I want. There you go. And then you can see here, for those who don't know, these are right now using the global controls, which are these. As soon as I go through a camera and I enable any of the camera effects, these are overriding actually whatever it's in here. And you can, if I start this should pick up the camera, and it does, and you can see it has a different focal distance, right? I can make it like so. And for instance, if I disable this, it should pick up the settings from the globals, meaning this. Okay, so for instance, this is in focus for the global one. And if I pick up the camera, then the focus changes to here. So it's two different um, cameras, let's say, right? This is using a global one, and this is specific to the cameras. And now this has changed. You have the bokeh, as always, should live on a camera. By chance, we didn't have anything, but in any scene, you should have at least a camera that you want to work from. And a few things have changed. And because the new camera is a bit different, and by that I mean you can have now motion blur per camera. And I'm going to show you this in a second. I just want to show you what's happening when you're working with the old system versus the new system. So for instance, if we're going here and we're enabling photographic exposure and optical effects and so on and so forth, but mainly the changes are that the bokeh, photographic exposure, lens distortion, and motion blur are now in a new place. I'm going to show you in a second, right? So let's put this at, I don't know, 200, 125, 16, 0. Let's put the overexposure to 1 so we let more light in. A bit of saturation and a bit of black crush. Okay, so this is what we're aiming for. And I'm going to save this as no com plus just to have it there, right? So this is how it works. Now, there are two things that you can do with cameras. You can have the camera effects, and then you can also have the camera attributes. But camera attributes, it just holds the camera type. So if you want to go fisheye, spherical, cylinder, or spherical, stereospherical, you can have that, right? But this is how it worked before. Now I'm going to jump into Maxon 24 with 3.5.17 in this case, and I'm just going to open the same exact scene, right? So it will be this one, no cam. It will show you exactly the same thing as in 3.5.15. Okay, so if I start rendering this, you're gonna see exactly the same thing. Assuming I've opened the scene in here, well, in 3.5.17 in this case, as it was opened here. So basically, if I open this one, what I render in here and what I render in here should be the same. Now, this is 3.5.17 by chance, just because I'm testing a new build that we did today. And I'd like to show you what are the changes. First, you're opening an old scene. This one has no camera, as you can see here, right? I can, of course, create a new camera. And if I do that and I go to the camera effects here, you're going to notice one little thing, and there's a legacy mode, okay? You need to upgrade your scene if you want to use the new camera. Now, at this point, the scene itself, you're going to see here, there's no post effects, it just says Redshift, right? And you have also the option to upgrade the scene. And when this happens, things will be moved to the camera attributes. If you can see here, the camera attribute is still the old camera attributes, right? So I'm going to upgrade the scene. Now, when you upgrade the scene, any sort of animation that's happening on the camera will be lost, okay? Parameters and so on and so forth. So I suggest if you have animated cameras to keep them as a backup, right? And you might want to, if let's say your camera is animated, you convert it to a new scene, and then you want to parent the new cameras to the old camera, so it moves the same way, or at least keep the old setup, old scene, until you decide it's time to change. Okay, but right now we're in 3.5.17, and things are a bit different. As I said, there's no Redshift post effects in here, right? And you have exactly the same thing as before, but with this upgrade scene. So let's see what this does. Let's look first at the dome light. Remember, the dome light is using a backplate. So if I go here to the backplate, you can see here backplate, right? No changes whatsoever. But if you upgrade the scene, and it should, things are different. You've noticed that this is different. Now there's an optical section in here, and there's an optical section in the camera as well, right? There's no camera effects. Everything goes into camera attributes. There's an optical section. Streak, flare, bloom, color controls, and lots did not change. But now we have a background option and an optical option. The optical option holds the photographic exposure, bokeh, motion blur, and lens distortion. Okay, and everything is tied. Now you can have per camera motion blur. And this is changed a bit, the simple and more complex way to deal with motion blur and exposure as well. You can see here EV only and filmic. Okay, and the way it works, there are a few changes regarding bokeh in this case, because bokeh now allows you to have a focus object, right? Like I can, for instance, pick one of these teapots, right? And it will use that exact transformation value. I mean, it will use the distance between the camera focal plane and the object. It won't use a, let's say this object is huge, like 100 meters tall, and you're not going to have the pivot object from the actual geometry, but the pivot where it's set, and for at least for geometries in Max, for instance, right? You can see some are created a bit different. So if I go, for instance, for this cylinder, hopefully, I think these are parented. Yeah, they're parented into a group. See this cylinder. Let's see if I can. I don't think I can pick it up directly. It doesn't matter. It has the actual pivot at the bottom. So the distance will be from the camera to that pivot, not necessarily to the perpendicular to the object. Okay, so bear in mind that. Besides that, you're going to see that when I'm changing and I'm picking focus and I'm changing focus, okay, what I'm changing actually is the aperture. There's no circle of confusion. See, aperture, it's 11 here, right? And I can change this manually, making this more defocused, or I can use this. I can use the focus picker, right? And say, hey, this is, well, let's get this one in focus and set then the actual aperture. You can see it here, right? It might take a while to make this a bit more or less visible in RV. And I can't say why this is happening, but let's see what the bokeh or this is coming from, right? And it's coming from the physical camera. And we can see this is 1.6, and then we can make it more or less, but it should be able, you should be able to do something like this and change the aperture, and this should be visible. If it's not, you'll have to make sure you're, maybe this is not in a precise dirty state. You can see here 163 and this is 429, right? So this is changing. This is not. So this is a small bug that I have in this exact version. And it's not 3.5.16, it's 17. It's an early beta for 3.5.17. So, but this should work just fine. Okay, and you can pick a focus object. Let's get this guy here. And the focus should be there. So if I move this object up and down, right, the focus moves with it. And this is really, really nice because it allows you to do many neat things. But there's also a focus picker. And you're going to ask me, how does the focus picker work with a picked object for the camera? So if I go back to the camera, right, we have this teapot set as focus object, but maybe I'm going to come here and pick the focus for someplace else, right? Well, this should change the offset. There's an offset value for the focus object. So let's click here, click, and although this doesn't change, and it should, this is again a small bug. I'm using an internal version. Basically, let's say this is the guy we're trying to do. If I put this at, let's say 120, it should give me this one in focus or around there. And you can see this is in focus, this is out of focus. If I put something like -30, it should be the blue one in focus or around there, because so I'm just eyeballing it. And this is, if this is 120, this is probably 110 or something like that. So I put negative 110, 110, 120. So let's say I should have this guy in focus. And to be honest, I don't know the values by heart. I mean, I can do something like this. This is 120, and I need a value of what? About 113 negative. So this should be in focus. And if it doesn't, again, I'm using a beta version of this. Let's try to put this 113. Okay, and well, in this case, it doesn't quite work because probably there's a bug someplace. Okay, but again, what it should be changing is the aperture. If I do Alt and drag, right, you can see here the aperture changing. It doesn't change here. It's not a big deal. You can also change it manually if you want to, and you can see this is working, right? Okay, so that's one little thing. Besides that, everything should translate okay, no problem whatsoever. But the biggest change besides this camera is the background. Now, if you're looking at 3515, we have a backplate on the dome line. If you're looking at 3516, you're not gonna have a, well, you'd still have a backplate here, right, which is in legacy mode this time. So we can say, hey, no backplate, and this becomes whatever you have as a background. So if I disable this from the background, I should have black, right? But there's a new background option on the camera. So I can come here, and now we have three options: off, global, or override. What does it mean? It means the following. This is the global side of the scene, and this is the local side of the scene. I can leave this as global. In this case, the background will be whatever I pick up in here in the globals. So if I go to textures and I pick something like, I don't know, something silly like a checker, like this checker, right? And you can see it's out of focus because right now this is set to in render, meaning this works as before, where your backplate was defocused based on the camera. But we can set it now to pre or post composite. And the changes, the difference between pre and post, is how if we apply post effects, like in this case, let's see, tone mapping. If you're applying tone mapping before or after comping the 3D scene on the backplate. Okay, let's check something else because that's very, very ugly. Now, let's do something silly like this. Okay, and again, this is coming from the global, but of course, again, I'm using beta software, don't worry about it. You can override this by setting this to off, and let me just expand this, right? The background, you can see here, doesn't have a column and an object, so to say, hey, this is coming from someplace else. No, it goes from the global. But I can set this to off, and you can see the background is controlled by the physical camera 001, and this is set to off. I can override that with my other image, and this is very interesting because you can have backplates based on the cameras, okay? And it's really handy. And let me just, let's see if I can have here, do I have someplace? I don't think so. So let's go to Redshift, references, colors, and I should have the image here. Okay, and I'm using the exact same thing as before. But since I have the same controls, I can say, hey, pre-composite or post-composite, right? Of course, if you don't want to bake this in with your render, you can set this to, after you've set your bokeh in the camera, Basically, the idea is the following. You have this plate that already has bokeh in it, but you want to add another object and you don't want to defocus it with your 3D bokeh. So at this point, you're gonna say, hey, this is um, pre or post composite, right? You set this to whatever you like, and then if you want to, you can set this to off. And when you render this, you have your alpha, and you can compose it on top of your uh, plate, your real plate in compositing world. So you don't bake this in. Okay. Besides that, you also have the option to move this around. Okay, so you can move it up and down, left and right, and can set color correction, a bit of things like this. You can also have an alpha from image. For instance, if this image is a JPEG, it has no alpha, right? But if it had an alpha, you can use it. Unfortunately, you can't have more than one background per camera, okay, or global. That might come later on, but right now you're, let's say, limited to just one. You don't have a scale option. You see here we have an offset X and Y, no scaling. And that's because, let me try to turn pretty much everything off, let's say. And see whatever we have here. Sun, we have 4 teapots. Okay, so this is what we're having, but you can see that this is set to stretch. And this is in sync with how this was configured. So if you're going to the background, you can see here, match rendering output, if that's what you want, or match the bitmap aspect ratio or the viewport aspect ratio, it's up to you. And you can change that in 3 ways. Stretch means fit it horizontally and vertically, so it distorts the image. Crop will fit it horizontally, and fit will fit it vertically, so it leaves you with black on the sides or on the top, depending on how your image is and what's the actual aspect ratio of this. Okay, you can, of course, as you see here, exposure, hue, saturation, things like this. Now, one thing I like to point out is that besides this, there are a few little changes for the parameters. So if you're going to the camera attributes, so camera effects, it's no longer used. As you can see here, it has been deprecated, so we can remove that. You're going to notice that the saturation for the optical side of things, right? Let me try to open this. Remember, we put this to 1.1 and now it's 0.1. So before this was 0 to 2. If you're looking at the photographic exposure here, you're going to see that saturation was from 0 to 2, okay? And default was 1, and now the saturation is from -1 to 1. That's why instead of 1.1, you got 0.1. It's just a remapping of the slider, not necessarily, well, in the value internally, right? So you can see these are close, 156,008. The image looks kind of the same, right? So you have to decide what you want to do with the post effects and the settings and the camera before starting or before converting your cameras or your scene. Okay, and this is a scene state. It's not you're not upgrading the camera, you're upgrading the scene, so the scene knows that we should use the new camera instead of the old camera. Now, if you're starting from scratch, the old controls, meaning these, are not there anymore, right? They happen to be there because I opened an old scene. So for instance, if I do a reset, okay, and I create a new camera, physical camera, doesn't matter. I mean, I can create one from here, right? and I'm just using Control C to do that. And I select the camera, and I go to the modifiers, and I try to use camera effects. As you can see, this is off. There's no button to upgrade because there's nothing to upgrade. The scene state, it's already upgraded. Okay, so you're gonna use the camera attributes that has everything that you need. Okay, don't try to mix cameras by copying and pasting between different, well, for instance, an old camera. Let me give you an example. Let's say this is your new camera, right? And let's try to say, hey, file export selected. Let's put it in downloads. And can I put this as something else? No, I have to save as. Save selected. Okay, and let's put that in downloads. And let's say, let's call this new cam. And this is the selected object. And you can see here, it's in, well, it's in the new camera mode, right? Now let's see what's happening if I open the old scene. No cam, right? And you can see that this, well, I don't have that. So let's create a new camera from this perspective. And because we are in the old state, right, we still see the old things. And that means exposure, blah, 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 blah. But if I merge, let's say, if I merge the newly exported camera or saved camera, okay, I want to pick up this guy because why not? Okay, let's call it new. And it's wherever it is, it doesn't really matter. But you can see that if you had anything on the as a camera attributes, they're not there anymore, right? It asks you for a scene upgrade. So if you upgrade the scene, your attributes should be there. But so don't try to mix old scenes with new cameras or new cameras with old scenes. Sorry, or new scenes with old cameras. Okay, you will have to upgrade the scene at a certain point. So this is how it works. If you have any questions, probably the biggest question will be, of course, where's my bokeh? Okay, I'm used with a circle of confusion and I can't find it anymore. Well, trust me, it's there. I can prove it to you starting from scratch. Actually, starting from this new camera because it's there. Okay, and let's do something really, really simple. Let's get a plane and 2 teapots because why not? Max has teapots. Okay, well, this is a bit too big for my liking, so let's make it like so. And we can move it a bit around. Come on, Max, play ball. Okay, and maybe something like, I don't know, something like this. Okay, and let me just extend this to the Redshift render view. If we set Redshift as a current render, of course, and this should be the default one. Save as default, thank you. And we're starting to render. It should pick up, of course, at this point, because max is max, it picks up the nothing. In this case, it should be this one. But it takes in, for here, it takes the front view because that was before extending the viewport. So I'm gonna click here, lock the camera, this gets locked, that's fine. And bokeh-wise, right, you can enable bokeh and do this manually. And you can see here aspect and spherical aberration. Okay, how do I? There seems to be some sort of bokeh in the scene. How do I control that? Well, you control that through the aperture. Okay, you want more bokeh or less bokeh, and not necessarily here where this is. It's kind of ending up at 22, right? And to be honest, the values that are in here for the aperture might be a bit off because this is not so much a complex equation to derive the circle of confusion from the aperture, but it also takes into consideration max units and a few things. So it might be a bit uh, different. Right now, there's nothing in here for you. So you can see here, we have camera attributes, right? So if you're looking at the globals, there's no bokeh here again, and there's no bokeh here, right? So the bokeh lives on the camera as it should, because it's something that's inherent to a camera, to a lens. Okay, and one thing you're going to notice that we have no photographic exposure here, and the reason for this is quite simple. If there's no camera in the scene, okay, and the photographic exposure, and it's part of the tone mapping, that's part of the optical side of the camera, it cannot be in here because there's no camera. Okay, so if that's what you're missing, you will have to create a camera, I'm afraid. Okay, so let's see how we can make this work or control the actual, not necessarily aperture, because you can of course come here and pick and change your focus, right, and change the distance. This is the aperture, you can see here. And you can see I can make it really, really small, 73, but the slider is from, well, it's a dynamic slider, right? But you see where I'm going with this. Let's make this, well, it should be 1.4, but it can happen that this did not change it on the camera. So let's go to the modifier and look at the values here. 73, and this is 1.2, so that's why it didn't change. So let's change it here and try to pick focus. And the question is, what's happening? I'm changing something here, and this should work, right? And let's see. It's, again, I'm on beta software, so this might be an actual bug. But don't worry about it, it should work. Let's try the focus picker again. Something like this. Okay, and well, we still don't have it, and this is a bit annoying because the aperture here says 1.3, and let's say 8, and this should say 8 again. This does sync. There you go. Sometimes it needs a bit of refresh, right? But this is how it works. So if you don't see any circular confusion, that's why you need to change the aperture. Okay, now hope it helps. And as always, if you have any questions, just shoot them on a forum. We're there to help you. Have a Cheers.